Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mavis Sanders. I'm Senior Research Scholar of Black Children and Families at Child Trends, and I am very happy and excited to be your host for today's webinar, Reimagining Black Family and Child Wellbeing in Research, Programming, and Public Policy. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items to share with you. And I'll ask Megan to forward the slide. If you are having any audio difficulties, you can dial in by phone. If you have need for technical support, Megan Treenan is online and she can be contacted by email at the email address that is posted on the PowerPoint. And during the panel discussion, please enter questions or comments using the chat feature. The submitted questions will be presented to the panelists during the Q&A session. And so with that, we'll move on to our panelists. And I have the distinct honor of introducing to you just a stellar group of policy, advocacy, and service leaders whose work includes, and Megan, if you can forward to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Whose work includes a focus on the well-being of Black children and families. In alphabetical order, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Leah Austin, who is the President and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute. Siobhan Davenport, President and CEO of Crittenden Services of Greater Washington. Terrence Moore, Chief Executive Officer at the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs, and Sunithia White, Director of Strategic Initiatives at Cities United. You'll also get a chance to meet our panelists at the very beginning of the webinar. But before we move to the webinar, I want to talk a little bit about the Child Trends New Applied Research Agenda on Black Children and Families. This webinar is part of our development of a research agenda that deepens understanding of the diversity of Black children and families, contextualizes Black children's and families' experiences within the systems, institutions, and organizations that impact them, and produces evidence to inform policies and practices that promote their well-being in the 21st century. We have been working on this new agenda for several months now, and have produced publications to lay the foundation for the work that's ahead. One of those is a brief that describes the approach that we'll be taking to develop this applied research agenda. Another reimagines the cultural assets of Black families with children and how that can inform policies and practices. We have a third brief that discusses the achievements, and Megan, we're ready for the next slide. We have a third brief that discusses the achievements and continued needs of Black adolescents and youth, as well as a blog that talks about bridging the mental health care gap for Black children and adolescents. Our most recent brief describes insights from service and advocacy leaders about an applied research agenda on Black children and families to inform our work moving forward. If you haven't already, we encourage you to go to the Child Trends website, where you will find all of these publications. We are excited for you to read them, share them with your networks, and please feel free to contact us with any questions or thoughts and opportunities for collaboration as we continue with this very important work. To continue the conversation and the discussion that we began with the brief on the shared insights, we have several of the contributors here today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly to the audience, beginning with Dr. Austin, and to do so in alphabetical order. Thank you.
Hi, well, good afternoon. And I totally understand. I've been forewarned that given my last name is Austin, I will be going first for a number of occasions during this webinar. And I am excited to be here. And so I am totally up for it. I am Dr. Leah Austin, the president and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute. I started there in August, so creeping up on 1 year. I've had a very long relationship with this organization, starting off as a fellow when the Pre-K for All DC initiative was housed at the National Black Child Development Institute. So just have a really long history and a deep love for the organization. I also am the mother of an 8-year-old son. So I center both my professional work and my personal life through the eyes and sort of lens of what does it mean to be a Black child in this country. I am super excited to be here with you all to talk and speak, but also really to learn and listen to my colleagues as well.
Thank you so much. Siobhan.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. And I am honored to be here with such an esteemed group of panelists. And as Dr. Austin mentioned, I'm here to share, but also to learn from our other panelists as well as from our viewers. My name is Siobhan Davenport. I'm the president and CEO of Crittenden Services of Greater Washington. We are an organization that is empowered by the teen girls that we serve from 6th through 12th grade in the Washington region. We're a school-based program steeped in social emotional learning practices, trauma-informed care, and positive youth development. We have over 700 teen girls in the program that meets weekly throughout the school year. And because of COVID, we were able to make some lemonade out of these lemons and have expanded to serve the families and communities in which our teen girls live as well. And my association with the organization dates back to 2015 when I was initially introduced to them in my role working for a small family foundation that was focused on disrupting poverty and causes of poverty for mostly women and their children. And so I've been a volunteer with the organization. I have connected the organization to funding because the mission speaks so personally to me. I am the child of teen parents who was actually raised by my grandmother. I didn't have a program like Crittenden, but I often say that my grandmother was my personal program leader who helped guide and steer me in the right directions of life. So again, I'm just so very pleased to be here. I am also the mother of a teen daughter and a teen son. So I certainly focus my personal and professional lens on this very topic. So thank you.
Mr. Moore.
Hi, everyone. I am Terrence Moore. I am the Chief Executive Officer, as was mentioned, of the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs. We were joking before we started that a few of us are sort of a newer crop of CEOs and leaders in our organizations. I started in October of 2021. Just a little bit about AMCHIP. We are the state association that is charged with implementing Title V block grant programs at the state and jurisdictional level. There are 59 around the country. I am deeply passionate I was listening to Siobhan talk about, I am the child of teenage parents, a father, and also to bring very seriously to this work at AMCHIP. How do we think through both the barriers, but also the facilitators, which we don't spend enough time talking about, to good, comprehensive services programs and sort of the social and emotional development of Black children in our work. So I'm excited to join today's conversation and look forward to also learning.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Sunithia White.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sunithia White, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives with Cities United. And Cities United supports a national network of mayors who are committed to creating safe, healthy, and hopeful communities by reducing ages of 14 and 24 by 50% by 2025. And we do that by working with cities, communities, and young leaders, mostly by meeting them where they are, and then supporting them to rise to this very important occasion for Black men and boys and their families. In my role, I am responsible for overseeing our young leader work, our national initiatives, virtual engagement, and our city coaching and capacity building. And this work is personal to me. Like others, I am the mother of a teenage daughter, and I have an 8-year-old son. But most importantly, in connecting this work to the work that we do around violence prevention and intervention, we believe that Black families and Black children deserve to grow up in spaces that are free from violence and also free from the trauma, the secondary and tertiary trauma that is related to violent incidents in communities.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for those introductions. And I will move to the first question. And I'm going to save you, Leah, on this one and ask Siobhan to start us off with this first question. And that question is basically, how does your organization define well-being for Black children and families?
Yes, thank you. Christensen Services defines well-being for Black children and families by the health, mental, social well-being of our families and our children, access to equitable educational opportunities, health opportunities, job opportunities. And we see our place in that equation as being the support for our teen girls to help them to see, and empower them to see for themselves possibilities that they may never see without having the program leader in our programs as a part of their lives. We have over 10 years of independent evaluations. And we often see when girls enter our programs, even as young as our 6th graders, who will share with us that college is not an option for them. They don't know anyone who's attended college. They don't have an interest. And because of that, they often don't have an interest in school because they don't see how that will lead to their long-term economic well-being. So through the work with our programs, which is evidence-based, we base our programs on a program called Step Up, and then we utilize input from our teen girls through focus groups and post-evaluations to add to our curriculum to address issues that are central to their lives. So by the end of even the very first year, we'll have a 6th grader who will say, I now want to attend college. I'm making goals for myself to attend college. I understand that if I attend school, if I do well in my studies, then these are the building blocks to having opportunities in my life that normally I would not get. So with our program, we actually seek out schools that have a higher suspension rate, a lower graduation rate, and a lower attrition rate. And we have a 100% graduation rate among all of our teen girls, even the population that we serve who are teen parents as well. And 83% of those young ladies do continue their education, whether it's a 4- or 2-year institution. They will enter a workforce development program, and we've had young ladies who've joined the military and served our country honorably. So we're extremely proud that by using those social emotional learning practices, positive youth development, empowering youth to see possibilities and to meet professional women particularly that look like them, so that they can understand that their circumstances do not have to determine the bright future that they have ahead of them.
Thank you, Siobhan. You've hit on a lot of key elements of well-being there. Other panelists, is there anything that you want to add? Anything that you want to emphasize from your organization's perspective around the well-being of Black children and families?
Sunitha here, and I'll add, I think that giving leadership, exposure, and opportunities to young Black people to stand in the gap and learn and be able to recognize and address inequities and systems that have impacted them is powerful. Because often in work, as it relates to children of color and families of color, things are done for us and not with us. And so helping young people and encouraging them to do that through our fellowship program here at Cities United, we work with young people to make sure that they are able to seize and capitalize off of those opportunities, and knowing that their voice with their local leadership, state leadership, and national leadership is powerful. Because addressing their well-being really can't be done if we are not listening to them about what is impacting their opportunities for success.
Great. I hear a lot about agency in some of these responses. Terrence, Leah, do you guys want to jump in there?
Sure, I'll jump in. And so, yeah, completely agree with what colleagues have shared so far. What I would say for NBCDI, and we focus organizationally on Black children in their earliest years, so birth through age 8 years old. And so we think about and define well-being as the tools and resources that they need to develop and grow into their full selves. I think to your point, some of these are what helps to build agency. I would also just add that we're really looking at it from a lens of what does it mean for Black children in particular to have an early childhood that ensures that they are happy and they are healthy. And so I'll just name a couple of sort of, if you imagine a Black child that's either your own Black child or a Black child just between the ages of birth to 8, we really look at their well-being as every Black child should attend a school that both affirms and expands them. They should enjoy meals with vegetables. I have this fight with my son, but yes, they should enjoy meals with vegetables, a safe internet experience, have books and toys that both reflect them and also introduce them to diversity and different kinds of people, clean air to breathe and green space to play. They're allowed to be children who make mistakes. And we know that the narrative around Black children is one that adultifies them and doesn't allow that. And so that's important to us, that they're allowed to be children who are going to make mistakes because they're learning. And that they live in safe communities that are surrounded by adults who love them. And these are adults who could be, yes, it could be your traditional or your typical or status quo parent, but it also acknowledges a value that people of color bring to our parenting and our raising of our children. And that's kinship care, that's family, friend, and neighbor care, like really valuing and seeing that as beneficial. I just quickly say to you, you know, the psychologist in me, so I studied psychology for my bachelor's and master's degree, wants to combine Maslow's hierarchy and Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. I know, very nerdy. But really what they're saying is, what are the systems? How are the systems and structures that surround our children set up to meet the hierarchy of needs that they have? And for NBCDI, we really think about that as not just college and career. Of course, college and career readiness is important, but we're also thinking about well-being as dimensions of their spirituality, mental, physical, emotional, intellectual, environmental. It's a new generation of young people, digital and nutritional, so that we're not focusing on individualistic outcomes, but how are we really ensuring healthy well-being so that their beauty and their brilliance can shape an entirely new world that's good for all of us.
I love that vision, Terrence. I know you must be, jumping at the bits to get into that conversation. So please do.
No, I'm excited to be joined by some fellow sort of nerds here on the front of talking about systems and the sort of hierarchies of needs. I actually think it's like a perfect segue, because I was thinking a lot about when Dr. Austin was talking about systems. That's sort of what we do at AMCHIP, the governmental public health systems, how they're working, more importantly, how they're not working to address the needs of Black children. And, I sort of want to take us back just a bit. Dr. Austin was talking about sort of the hierarchy pieces. I was thinking about the importance of the built environment. And when I think of the built environment, I think of it in terms of how are the needs, the healthcare infrastructure needs, meeting and addressing, and through the points that Sunithia brought up, how are the experiences of individuals brought into the room to be able to create the superstructure of needs that we know are required to have thoughtful, good, not just good, but excellent health and care throughout the life course. But before we sort of even get into the systems piece, we have to sort of acknowledge what I think we're all experiencing and have experienced for some years now, sort of structural pieces, structural racism. What often it's a new concept for our country, apparently, to be talking about racism and racism's sort of pervasiveness in terms of how it has eroded over time, the capacity for us to do this work meaningfully and well, the historically unacknowledged systemic inequalities that we have dealt with as a nation, and how it continues to sort of impact the work that we do. And so at AMCHIP, what we do and what we've been thinking about is some of these pieces are very foundational. How are we measuring results? How are we sort of talking about and bringing families and Black children into the room? What do our partnerships look like? We have to have deep, thoughtful, cross-cutting partnerships that don't just bring maternal and child health into bear, but they're thinking about the other outlier interconnected issues such as housing, such as education, such as mental health, et cetera, et cetera. The environment, I love the piece around breathing clean air. And if we look at the literature and what we know to be true is environmental hazards and how Black communities, Black families are disproportionately impacted by a lack of clean water and air, et cetera. And so I think these are all important issues that we think about through the social justice lens, but particularly using a much more pointed structural racism and undoing the structural racism that we see lens in our work at AMCHIP.
This is great. I'm hearing a lot around cross-sector kinds of work, that the well-being cannot be focused solely on one aspect of child development, but on multiple aspects of child development and the systems that impact them. So with that, what would it take from your perspective? What would it take for this nation, all of the nation, right, to sort of come together and achieve this new vision, this reimagining of not just Black family and child well-being that is good, but to your point, Terrence, that's excellent. Like, if we're reimagining, what would excellence in well-being look like for Black children and families? And what would it take for this nation to achieve it? I'm going to start with you, Terrence, on this one.
I started my professional career working at a couple what I consider to be sort of foundational signature pieces that go with me every day. I worked at the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Prison Project, and saw the sort of disparate outcomes in terms of over-incarceration and people who look like us being sort of involved unnecessarily so because of, someone brought up earlier, the mistakes that we make as children. We all made them, but we are sort of over-policed, over-incarcerated. But I think in my sort of second career piece that I bring to this work every day is I worked on the Hill, I worked in the Senate, and when I walk to the halls of the Senate and I have friends who still work on Capitol Hill now, there are less people who look like us making policy for people who look like us. And I think in addition to that, we are navigating, at least in my lifetime, a real sort of impasse in terms of our identity as a nation, and really sort of having discourse on what we believe are facts, disinformation. And so I think it's really important for us to achieve what you talked about. Mavis, is for us to really think about really the body politic. Like, how are we getting in there? It is tough. We have to be tenacious, but we can't sort of sit by, idly by, and not be engaged meaningfully in sort of these political conversations. I was looking, the Dean of Howard Law School, I was looking at a talk she was giving recently about lots of the sort of not great legislation, to say the least, that is sort of moving about our country on any range of issues. And what she said in this particular talk is how the discussions we're having about race, or what the contours that are being put on our ability to talk about race right now, it's very vague. It's rightfully vague. It's allowed for us to not be able to talk about the things that are truly happening. It's to sort of de-emphasize. It's to put the veil over, if you will, issues. So I would sort of answer your question by saying it is important, more so now than really ever, for us to continue to be out in front on issues, speak the truth, share information, tell our stories. Everyone in this room today, this virtual room, has a story to tell about the impact of our work, who we are as our lived experiences, et cetera. And so I would say the policy, the voting box comes first.
Definitely. So changing the politics, becoming a part of the conversation, the decision-making conversation. Siobhan, what are you thinking? How do we break into those conversations to make sure that we're shaping them in the ways that Terrence is suggesting?
Yes, and Terrence, I really appreciate what you just said. And I've been with our organization now for a little more than 3 years. Mm-hmm. And we embarked on a journey of really empowering our teen girls to become advocates. We've always done that for them to be advocates for themselves and for their families, but we pushed the envelope and wanted them to become advocates in their own community. And we have our girls lead with what policies or what challenges that they're facing, and what policies do they recommend that could alleviate those. During the pandemic, we certainly increased that advocacy. Our teen girls were sharing with us that their major concern was having access to good quality mental health and good quality education. Mm-hmm. So I would say all politics is local. And I think it's essential that we get involved at a local level with your city or your council. We emphasize to our young ladies that, we're in Montgomery County and the District of Columbia, that our council members represent us and they take meetings and from the citizenry that's voting for them. And so it's important for us to instill that in our youth, but also to educate the adults in our community to understand that they have power, and what matters to them matters to the entire community. So I definitely believe that we must almost have a campaign in educating families, parents, children on the importance of their voice, how it matters, and ways in which they can connect locally to change laws and policies to ensure that their needs are being met.
I love that. And I hear a lot of synergy between that and the leadership that you were talking about, Sanithia. So do you want to jump in there and talk about Cities United and how they view changing the changes that need to be made in the nation to achieve the well-being of Black children and families?
Thank you. So first, I'd like to say, to follow up on my two colleagues who've spoken, when we see government and elected leadership investing in safety and freedom on the other end, and making the commitment that they are making to prosecution and incarceration, on making sure that they are investing to boost education for Black children. As you all are familiar with, some of our lower performing schools are poorly invested in, ignored, and not engaged enough to get to that young person, that family. Looking at how healing-centered approaches for families who've been impacted negatively by violence or other adverse experiences. And then also recognizing that to build an inclusive economy, you have to address how Black families have been on the edge of being able to really provide for their families. That goes into how we support families, how we support communities of color, and how we look at reshaping systems, especially in the criminal and juvenile justice system, because they've been invested in heavily enough that they have set so many negative consequences for communities of color. And until we make higher investments to change those things, we won't be able to turn around how our young people, our young Black children, are able to grow up and thrive.
Thank you. And Leah, we are hearing a lot about how the nation needs to change in order to achieve this reimagined well-being for Black children and families. Anything that you want to add to this conversation at this point?
Sure. I mean, I think my colleagues have really hit an important point around the importance of policy. So what I would just say there, rather quickly, when it comes to NBCDI, so we have a policy fellowship that's actually in its second cohort that focuses on strengthening the pipeline of Black and Brown policy leaders, policy makers, folks that are interested in policy and who are also values aligned. So I would say that, that's a flag we're trying to hold, is how do we shape to the point that the colleagues have made, the tables where our policy leadership sit. So I would add that. A couple other things I would say, and sometimes I will totally admit to you all that sometimes I feel like a little bit of a Debbie Downer when it comes to policy. And I'll say why. Because one, I think absolutely policy is critical. We know this, right? But good policies, if and when they even become law, can become bad practice, right? They can become bad practice if it's implemented from a place of fixing problems, not supporting people. So at NBCDI, we think a lot about the culture, like the culture change work that's also necessary, right? So how do we both challenge and disrupt negative, stereotypical narratives of Black children, families, and communities that keep people from both seeing and experiencing us as humans, and therefore create or support policies and systems that are deficit-based, end up being implemented with racist views at worst, biased views at best, or biased beliefs at best, right? And so we really, think a lot about what is that culture change work? What does that look like that also kind of undergirds any policy work that we need to do? The second thing I would just name or share with you all is that in 2021, we co-authored with Dr. Ioma Aruka. So shout out to Ioma Aruka, because she's just an amazing, brilliant researcher and complete colleague and fan of NBCDI. And the feeling is mutual, obviously. So we co-authored the Black Child National Agenda, which outlines 10 policies that we feel like if we properly invest in these policies, they'll do a couple of things. One, they'll protect Black children and their families from racism, discrimination, and material hardship. They will promote Black children and their families' economic security, health, and access to quality early learning opportunities. And lastly, they'll preserve Black children and their families' cultural identity and heritage. And you can go to our website, which is nbcdi.org, and download the report. download the agenda, which I encourage you to do. I think you'll see the policies and they will resonate with you. They'll make sense to you. But again, I would really just like sort of amplify and underline that policy is one part of the puzzle and an important part of the puzzle, but they're also, as I'm sure we know from just what we have experienced over the last few years and generations before us, that there's this real cultural change work that has to happen, which is a different conversation than a policy conversation. The last thing I would say there is I always think about, and I'm probably going to date myself now, but there was the book and some video series where there's a will, there's an A, right? So in this context, right, when there's a will, there's a way. If we love Black children and families, like we will make this happen. If you think about who you love, you will do whatever, sometimes scary, whatever you have to, whatever you can to ensure that they have a healthy well-being. And so we as a country actually need to ask ourselves the question, do we in fact love Black children and families? And we have to ask that difficult question. It shouldn't be a difficult question, but apparently it is. We have to ask that question and then build from there.
Well, Leah, you know, I can't just move on to the next question without giving our panelists an opportunity to jump in there. We have established, I think, you know, quite clearly the importance of policy, both local and national, you know, changing that policy, shaping that policy, preparing the next generation of leaders to be engaged in that policy. But you bring up culture, right? And we haven't talked as much about how do we advance the cultural change that's necessary to complement and to guide the policies and to ensure that the policies are implemented effectively. So does anyone want to talk about that sort of cultural change where we expect the well-being of Black children and families to be central to what we do, simply out of respect for their humanity and their citizenship? So how do we go about that cultural change? Anybody want to jump in there before we go to question 3?
I'll jump.
Jump. There you go.
I think we first start having conversations about on both sides of the aisle and in communities of color and with those who say they are our allies in this work, with having an honest conversation about how policies have negatively impacted our community. And it's been intentional and hurtful. And now we're seeing the effects of a lot of those intentional policies. And so I think, you know, starting the conversation there is necessary. And then second, as we look at ways to lift up new policy leaders and thought leaders, making sure that we are removing the fear from the work in policy. Terrence stated that he worked on the Hill and didn't see a lot of folks who looked like him. If you are a young person aspiring to make change, and that is what you see by way of someone else, it looks impossible or looks like it's too difficult. And so we need to encourage young people and those who feel like they can sit on the sideline because it's not their problem, to have those honest conversations where it matters. And they can't be scared of losing friends. They have to embrace realizing who is really for them and really for their people. Because as it comes to our culture, entertainment, Hollywood, whatever you want to call it, has no problem bastardizing our culture for the bottom line. And so we have to respond differently as to how we engage at that level as well. And then at the end, just piggybacking on what Dr. Austin said, and that's really doing things from the beginning with an anti-racist lens. Because then without doing it that way, then we have put ourselves in a position where we have to go back and unpack all of these things and help folks understand why these policies and systems are rooted in oppression and racism, and educating them and being very clear about what has to change for the culture to change moving forward.
And I would just like to quickly add, as a direct service organization that serves mostly Black girls, and we also have brown girls as well, the Black Lives Matter movement became a pivotal point for us to have these kinds of conversations with the majority of our funders who unfortunately don't look like us, as well as individuals, foundations, government officials, etc. I think the timing is, I'm being very optimistic. I think the timing is very key right now, that our allies are willing, not only willing to listen, but they're willing to stand up at this time. And that's just, from my point of view, being a direct service organization at the local level. I'm seeing much more openness and embracing of these kinds of tough conversations, and having our allies bringing in others in their network to be a part of these conversations and to really uplift the challenges that our teen girls and their families are having, but not in a way that is belittling to our families, but in a way that our allies are actively listening and really want to hear from our teens and their families how they can be impactful in disrupting these racist barriers and systems that our teen girls are navigating.
I think this is a really excellent place to sort of hone in on and pick apart for a little bit, and sort of building on all of my colleagues' comments. You know, I was sitting here thinking about, we're here because of the beginning of the democracy, right? We are here because of sort of systematic oppression from day one, and even prior to day one, that really centered the patriarchy and sort of has systematically worked for hundreds and hundreds of years to put people in boxes, to sort of strike sort of violence, sort of either emotional or actual violence on individuals. And so I always think about this around sort of what are the contours of human rights. And when we think about it from the sort of like the Black family or Black children's lens, I always think of how important it is for us to have this sort of intersectional coalition that is thinking about almost every issue that is a blow to human rights. Because if we can do that, that causes the cultural shift. So what do I mean by that? We can't just talk about, we are all here because we are like checked in and find valuable and are deeply passionate about Black families and children. Yes, but we also have to be checked in and deeply passionate about women's rights, women's reproductive rights, LGBTQ same gender rights, the environmental and health rights and access to that. And so I think the culture shift that you asked a question about, Mavis, I really think is this much more sort of broad, we can be specific, but there's a value structure a value system proposition we have to discuss. And we have to call it out and not be gaslit and be fighters for what we perceive to be other people's issues. So I think those are the ways that we produce this cultural shift, that we really change the norms and sort of start to repattern what we've been fighting against for hundreds of years.
Thank you all for those insights. We, you know, even from the chat box, as well as from the conversation, we see that this is multi-tiered, multi-year work, right? It is work that has been a part of our struggle and will continue to be, because we are trying to change the hearts and minds, the viewpoints of folks across generations, right? And so that leads me to the next question. Before we go to the audience and the participants for questions as well, I want to leave time for that. So as we begin to reimagine the well-being of Black children and families, what do you see as the optimal relationship between research, policy, practice, including service and advocacy to achieve that well-being. So how can we inform the conversations that need to take place, both within our communities and with allies, external audiences, others, policymakers? How can we use research, policy, advocacy, and service to really advance those kinds of conversations that change both policy as well as culture? And let's begin with Sunithia.
So my first thought is on one of the last things you said, and that is the service. In the Black community, we are built on service, have founded many organizations who thrive on service, and because of circumstance, have been in service to one another for centuries, right? But to pull on the other pieces with policy and advocacy, and it's going to sound familiar, it's utilizing that service as an avenue and connecting to policy and advocacy to begin to stand up and do more. Taking your time to draw attention, taking your time to pull others along with you to get in good trouble is one of our best opportunities to lift this up, because nobody is going to come and do it for us. Another opportunity that I think we have in our professional capacity is to learn more about what each organization is doing and looking for opportunities to bring them in when you're at the table and there's an appropriate opportunity for a counterpart to be there. We don't have any magic potions for many of the ills that are facing our community and impacting our children. But I would bet a little bit of my time and money that if I sit at a table and something comes up, I can think of other folks who are leaders of color or Black leaders who are doing things intentionally and for the right reasons that I need to make sure get connected in that space to stand up. So for lack of a better word, we're stronger together in number. We are stronger when we know what the other organizations are doing, and we use our relationships and our platforms to promote that policy, advocacy, and service for our community starts with us and should not start without us.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to jump in there about the connections between research, policy, service, and how we can advance well-being through those relationships and reimagining those relationships?
So I'll jump in quickly. And I'm going to jump in and do two things. So one, I just want to read a quote. So if you've not read Dr. Sean Jenwright's new book, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves, I'm not his PR agent, but you should totally read it. It is a awesome, awesome, awesome book. So there's a quote in the book where he says, inequality erodes our ability to imagine any other way, and it conditions us to only focus on surface solutions to deep problems. It predefines our dreams and dictates what we can imagine. That's why so many of us have a hard time describing what freedom feels, looks, smells, and sounds like. We haven't spent much time with that type of question, and sometimes find it difficult to visualize a world we want to create. That quote, I probably read it every day because it just resonates with me. And I think, Dr. Sanders, to your question, it speaks to what we need to request, ask, demand for in the relationships you just named. So I think a lot about research agendas. And I have to say, I appreciate how you have specifically taken on your role, which is to talk to people and ask really good questions and find out what the field needs. We've done that one-on-one. Obviously, this webinar is a part of that. And so what I would just say is like creating research agendas with the curiosity of a 5-year-old. Like we need to have a new set of questions. We need to have a new methodology. We need new or at least different standards of what quality and excellence are. I would also add to really build on the assets of people of color. You know, if we think about it, there's a grit, there's a resiliency, there's a faith, there's a hope that has kept us generation after generation after generation after generation, still here, still committed to the work, still smiling, most days still laughing and looking good, right? That's capital. That's an asset. So where is the research that's not telling us we need to build grit, but is actually learning from us what it means to be gritty? I don't know if that's the best word to use, but what does that, like really tapping into our assets and our expertise. The last thing I would just say, again, in terms of assets and expertise, and again, our organization really focuses on our youngest children. And so we think a lot about early learning and care, right? And I think we're often told that our kind of parenting as people of color is wrong, right? But we need research that doesn't tell us it's wrong and tell us all the other things we need to do, but really looks at how, as people of color, we have cared for, we have taught, we have educated, we have learned our children for generations. I can literally sit here and tell you that I have 3 siblings, there's 4 of us. We spent a lot of time at the lady down the street who lived next to the candy lady's house in DC. We were there a lot. We were at my grandparents' or my aunt and uncle's every summer for the entire summer in Bowling Green, Kentucky, right? Because there's a communal living and raising. That's kinship care. That's family, friend, and neighbor care. Those are elements of who we are that are complete assets. That's capital. We need to be researching or studying what's been working for us, and not just sort of having this very status quo standard of excellence or quality or evidence-based that then tells us that everything that's brought us here is wrong. We need a research agenda that really focuses on everything that's kept us here and kept us here despite systems that are literally designed to tear us down.
That's great. And thank you so much for sharing that direct quote as well. So we've heard about the importance as we look at these connections, about making new connections that make good trouble. I'm going to steal that, Sunithia. You know, we hear about asking new questions with the curiosity of a 5-year-old that is grounded in the cultural assets of Black children and family. Siobhan, as a leader in the service field, how do you see the sort of optimal connection with research and policy, and how can we bring those together to really advance the well-being of Black children?
Oh, yes, thank you. And I thank my colleagues as well. This is just such a powerful discussion, and thank you for raising such great points. As a direct service provider, Crittenden Services really focused on middle and high school teen girls. We have to have their voices at the forefront of collaborating with policy, research, advocacy, and service. And in that, what I mean is that so often, particularly when we're dealing with minors and then we're dealing with Black female minors, that their voices are often overlooked, ignored, and this is what they're telling us. I don't want to say that I'm saying this. Our teen girls tell me or tell our organization that they feel ignored, they feel belittled, they feel invisible in a lot of ways. And so we can't move forward unless we have centered their voices in all aspects of this. The services that we provide are the services that our teen girls and their families tell us that they need. And so we've been able to pivot to address certain issues as they arise because we are listening to our teen girls and their families, and not just listening, actively listening, but actually instituting the work that is needed to provide the support that they tell us that they need. So I think that we have to really be humble in this work, right? We have to be, I love gritty. I'm going to borrow that, Dr. Austin. We certainly have to be gritty. We have to be resilient, but we also have to be humble and ensure that the families that we're serving, that our Black families, our Black children's voices are certainly embedded and lead us in this work.
That's great. And Terrence, can you add an element around policy and policy leadership, the research and the service? Yes.
These comments have been so great. They're standalones. So I want to, they need to just hover in the room. What I'm struck by though, is this, in thinking through all of these pieces, what I keep coming back to, which I think is maybe a layer onto the theme, is we simply are not, I'm going to be careful of saying not asking for enough, because we shouldn't be asking, but there's more that we need, that we should take, that is required. And so I think the bigger question is, we've elected local officials, state officials, we've elected presidents. So the question for me is, at what point do we continue, or do we just literally demand that what we have been given is unacceptable, and it is not advancing or changing our narrative? It is not shifting the culture in the way that we know needs to be shifted. And so I don't have an answer for that, but this conversation is inspiring because it reminds me that we can't play Little League baseball here. Like, this is a major league problem that we're managing. And so I think the bigger question is, what can we be doing collectively? And so as you bring the piece around the research agenda, and I echo my colleagues around just being, and like we are sort of new partners, new friends. I want to sort of say that Mavis reached out to me right when she first started, and I had first started at AmChip. And so it takes these sorts of relationships. I am a connector by nature. And so it's like continuing to build and build and build, and becoming even more powerful, even more multidisciplinary in our work, and being able to deliver what we know needs to be heard in terms of our voice around what the vision should be for our work.
I sincerely appreciate that, because you remind us that this is big. You all have underscored that we are playing in the major leagues. This is a monumental task that we are presented with, but that we do have what it takes to address it if we work collectively and understand ourselves as not in this alone, but that we are a part of a number of organizations and individuals who have this same big dream for our children, our families, and for the nation, really, ultimately. So thank you so much. This is the first part of the conversation. I am going to ask Megan, who has been manning or overseeing the chat, to see if there are any questions from our audience.
Yeah, so the first question, we just wanted to make sure we knew the name of the book that Dr. Austin read from.
That powerful quote, Dr. Austin.
Sorry, I literally have it right here. So it's actually the 4 pivots: reimagining justice, reimagining ourselves. And I can type it in the chat.
Excellent.
Thank you. All right, the chat is very active. So let me go back towards the beginning and try to find some questions for you. There's just been a lot of positive feedback as well throughout the whole time. So thank you guys again.
Very good. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience.
Okay, so we have one person that was commenting on, I think it was Terrence, when you were talking about voting, especially, and they said, indeed, voting is needing, but what happens when you have only two political parties that are both right-wing and both represent the interest of Wall Street and the weapon industry?
Want me to dive in on that one first?
Sure. Thank you, Darren.
Remembering nonpartisan.
We're a nonpartisan, right? As is answer. Thank you, Kristen. How to answer this and comprehensively is the question du jour. I will say this. It goes back to my last point. We are sort of citizens with a responsibility. And, I am not lost in the fact that there is a degradation of rights as it relates to voting as well. So that is not lost on me, but I will say this. The first time I voted, as soon as I turned 18, voting age, it was instilled on me by my grandmother and by several of my aunts. Speaking of that, what Dr. Austin talks about, that sort of that care circle that is beyond the sort of white Anglo-Saxon patriarchal prototype of what a family should look like, by the way. That was instilled in me earlier, that we should exercise our rights, because people quite literally died so that we could sit on this webinar and sit in these seats and have these sorts of conversations. And so I believe that there is more that we can continue to do as it relates to amplifying our voices. And as such, not just amplifying our voices for the status quo, really putting into the ether, which I don't think we do enough of as a sort of society and folks that are doing work on behalf of our issues, putting into the ether the things that we know could move the needle, not just the things that are status quo, not just the good policy, but putting into the ether things that get people inspired. And I will say the erosion of inspiration comes when our ideas are flat. And so we have to put forward ambitious ideas, prototypes of what we know can work, prototypes of what we know has worked in other places, and be able to lift up the voices of our communities moving forward. So, and I think holding our folks who are elected accountable. I think that I can say that as a nonpartisan organization as well, being able to hold folks accountable in all political realms.
Absolutely. And making sure that we have the evidence that's necessary and the data necessary to hold them accountable. I think links really well to the conversation we had about the connection between research, policy, advocacy, and service. Thank you so much. Any other panelists want to jump in there around how do we maintain the optimism that we can make change through policy and voting and those things, given restrictions, given constraints? Anybody else want to jump in there? If not, I'm going to ask Megan to go to the next question.
The only thing I would quickly say, which is probably not all that helpful, is that, I don't know, like maintaining our optimism gets back to what I said about like faith and hope and grit and resilience. It's literally what we do. So we can't stop being who we are and doing what we do. Yes, the challenges are real. The challenges seem to be becoming more challenging every second moment of the day. But I just have to say, I continue to just sit in, the truth of our ancestors, and what's brought us, as Terrence was saying, what has brought us thus far is what will continue to move us. And also in the reality that I literally may not ever see the day that I'm dreaming of, but that's not gonna mean I stop. I'm gonna continue working and doing and being, because this is this isn't a job, it's calling work. And I think that's part of what we have to do, is really dig into our callings and really understand the work in those ways, not just as a job, but really as a calling.
Thank you so much. Megan, do we have another question from the audience?
Yeah, I have one that's asking, how would you define social fluidity in the 20th century from your perspectives?
Social fluidity.
Yep, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Can we, panelists, do you feel comfortable sort of addressing that question, or would you like the individual to clarify what they mean by social fluidity? Clarification might be necessary. Yes, I see head nods. So if someone in the chat box can sort of clarify how they're using the term social fluidity within the context of this question.
Yeah, while we wait for that, I can jump to another question.
Okay. Thank you.
So the panel spoke a little bit about the need for a narrative shift. How do we shift the story about Black children and families?
I can take that one, Mavis.
That's great. Thank you, Sunita.
We start telling our stories first and better, and then we also start responding to the constant negative portrayal of the Black community and Black children. We drive the news, we drive what trends. And so we need to work harder at pushing the full story of Black people in this country. We need to push their greatness. We need to push their successes, and even talk about how many failures didn't stop them. And so that's going to change that narrative. And then we also have to start demanding some of these organizations who come around and capitalize off of buzzwords and come into communities. I call them poverty pimps. We also have to begin to challenge what they say about us, what they promote about us, what they write in funding proposals about our communities and share with corporations or other funders. We have to control the narrative that way. And, one of my other earlier comments, I talked about how we support when you support one another. And there are organizations for Black journalists all across the country. When something good
I'm sorry, Sunithia, you're freezing.
happens, how good of a job are we doing? Sorry. Am I back now?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. How can we start to funnel these stories to publications of color who were led by people of color, to photojournalists of color? It is our job to make sure that pipeline always has something in it that tells the whole entire truth of our story, our history, and also the circumstances that people of color find themselves in.
That is great. I love that, not only holding other people accountable, but also holding ourselves accountable about the stories that we tell, how we tell them, to whom we tell them. Thank you. That is a very powerful response. Any other panelists want to add anything to how do we change the narrative? How do we gain better control of the narrative about Black children?
I'll just highlight or amplify something Sunithia said, which was the full story. So, we're not here to pretend like we're perfect people. We're not, right? But that's the point of a full story, is that it tells every and all sides, and that we also have to push back on the narratives that we believe about ourselves. And there are, all sorts of reasons why we believe them. That is one of the byproducts, one of the most painful byproducts of systemic racism, is that you start to believe what you've been told about yourself. And so we have to untangle that by telling our children different stories and helping them see, again, not just, see, and like when I talked about books and toys that reflect them, of schools that affirm them and expand them, right? So we're intersectional in so many ways, and there's such a beauty and a brilliance in that. And so how do we lean into that and really see that as part of our full story? And so I think just Sanithia's point there was just a really important point, that it's the full story. It's not a narrow story. It's not a negative only story. It's not a perfect Black excellence only story either. It's a full story of our full humanity that we need to really commit to.
And I would just like to add that our young people are already doing this. They're on social media and they are telling their stories. And into Dr. Austin and Sanithia's point, they're telling their full stories and being very authentically themselves. I think it's up to us adults to help uplift those stories. And it's our responsibility to learn from those stories, because, I think about growing up with my grandmother and being very much immersed in a much older generation. And there were things that you just didn't talk about. And I just accepted that, that I didn't ask certain questions. We didn't talk about, how I got here with, two teen parents kinds of things. And I just have to say that our new generation just gives me personally so much hope, because they are so authentic and so willing to share their stories. But we as adults, it's our responsibility to help uplift those stories as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Next
Megan,
question.
yes, please.
So another person said that they loved Dr. Austin's point about how good policy can be bad/not helpful in practice. Are there any particular examples that could be shared to go a little deeper on how we recognize this point and move the cultural shift that we need?
So, Terrence, did you want to jump in? You go ahead.
I when the question came up and asked for an example, I'll just share. For my my master's thesis, I did on the intersection of race and public housing in the city of Chicago context. At the beginning of the tearing down of the large projects that are sort of almost everyone is sort of aware of, and the displacement of thousands and thousands of Black people throughout the city of Chicago. So a couple things that we have experienced, most of us who have been sort of listening to news over the last few years have heard about sort of what it gets described, going back to these conversations that Sanithia has mentioned, the sort of the violence in Chicago and what is happening there. And it's like, we have literally created conditions, we destroyed the built environment, and then we are shocked when there's violence and mayhem and chaos. And, when the projects were there, all these residential facilities, there were very specific policies that were put in place in the 90s around welfare reform that required households in the city of Chicago projects that be 2-parent homes, or you didn't get as many benefits if a father was in the home. So it was disincentivized to have a male in the household. And so that's the sort of flow down impact of bad policy. And our ability to be able to sort of write policy requires us to be vigilant in terms of implementation and being able to ensure that we don't have unintended consequences, which is, that's on a good day. I say unintended consequences, but some of it is intentional violence, intentional destruction of our community. So that's how I would respond to that.
Thank you, Terrence. And this is oftentimes in our modern times under the guise of, reform, innovation. So it's never with the sort of, it's never presented as an intentionally destructive policy. But if we are not sort of wary and vigilant about how it's being implemented, to Dr. Austin's point, it can have these very sort of negative consequences for Black children and families. So thank you. I think we have maybe one time for one more, Megan. And I also saw something in the chat box asking for maybe Shaban, if you can talk about this point, or Sunithia, about service. What seems to work with the populations that you work with? And you say it's evidence-based. If you can sort of talk a little bit more about that, and we'll close out this audience portion. But Megan, please, the next question.
Okay, the next one I'll get to is, could someone address the complexity that intersectionality brings to the table? For example, how do we dismantle intersecting racist and transphobic biases such that the erroneous idea that Black families are more likely to reject their LGBTQ plus children and less likely to become more supportive of them over time, while still investing in a culturally safe programs that to support Black families and LGBTQ plus youth? That was long, if you need me to repeat any of it.
Panelists, would you like for it to be repeated, or did you get the gist of the question? Is around the complexity that an intersectional approach presents for us telling the complete story, our whole story, and challenging some of the sort of negative framing that doesn't sort of fully reflect the Black community.
You know, I can dive in a little bit on this. I think it's a complex question in which I, you know, as someone that identifies as sort of gay, queer, you know, same gender loving, there are lots of many ways in which we all identify. I've often said in conversations with friends, while that's an important aspect of my identity, and it's an intersecting part of my identity, I feel sort of Black first. This is, you see my Black skin when I enter a room. That is typically how I'm viewed. I think there's something about us still needing to grapple with sort of the racial identities piece that is sort of front and forward for me. I think it is this notion that somehow that Black families or Black people are sort of not affirming their sort of LGBTQ plus sort of brothers and sisters and children. I think that's a fallacy. I don't know how to say that other than just say it's a fallacy. I think what is important in these sorts of dialogues is creating the conditions that we talked about earlier for the sort of social change of it all. What does it look like to create healing, affirming environments, period? And when you can do that, all intersecting identities get to, dare I say, breathe, get to be. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to think about all of our systems and all of the various ways that we get to do that and can do that as a society.
Thank you, Terrence. Anybody else want to add to Terrence's response? I do want to say, you know, kudos, and I'm excited to share that my colleague Krishana Lloyd and I are working on a 100-year sort of review of research on Black children and families. And to your point, Terrence, that narrative that has come out that Black families are more rejecting of LGBTQ youth, family members, etc. We have some evidence that is not the case, but our research hasn't really explored it, and we haven't sort of shared that evidence to disrupt that narrative. And so again, we are not controlling the narrative as we've said before. So I see this is definitely an opportunity for research that really centers the voices and experiences of Black families and children, and that looks at different kinds of questions to produce different kinds of research and evidence is really important. And we're happy at Child Trends to be able to contribute to that effort. Okay, and with that, maybe the last question, if that's okay with you, Megan, to sort of talk to folks about service, Shaban, and Sanithia, about what seems to be working for you on the ground. You spoke earlier about the change that you've seen in the young women that you work with the girls and young women that you work with. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what seems to be working for you in terms of you achieving their well-being?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that question. I think fundamentally what Crittenden does is that we build a safe space for transformative conversations, for healing, for authenticity. And we do that by establishing trust. And I think that is the key in serving communities, that you must have that trust. And so the way our program works and the way our program leaders work, that our youth know, our teen girls know that our program leaders are just one of the trusted adults in their lives, and that they can come to them with any question, any concern, any challenge, any experience, and that they know that they will not be judged for it. And if you can build that trust, that's when you can meet our teen girls where they are, and we can relate to them where they are, but then we can help propel them to greater. And they trust us in a way that our teen girls will tell us that they don't always trust their teachers, they don't always trust their coaches, but they know that our program leaders are there for them. And having that support, as you all know, research shows just having that one trusted adult in a child's life can certainly change the trajectory of that child's life. So once we've established that trust, we can introduce other aspects to our teen girls' lives. The advocacy component, looking at how they can explore their goals and their dreams, and allowing them to define success in the way that they want to define success for themselves, and then supporting them every step of the way and empowering them to achieve the goals that they've set out for themselves. So I think that holds true for anyone who's doing just direct service work. You have to have the trust of those in which you are serving.
Thank you so much, Shaban. Sanithia, anything you want to add?
I would just add that we are being intentional about selecting and going with best practices or evidence-based programs, or what works in communities based off of the makeup of the community and the community needs, instead of trying to go in and making a square peg fit in a hole. Making sure that what we're doing in communities on behalf of young people, especially as it relates to violence, is going to be helpful and not harmful.
Thank you. Thank you all. This has been just a very inspiring conversation, and I so appreciate your time. As we approach the Juneteenth holiday to commemorate the unofficial end of slavery for the enslaved people in Texas, and to recommit, importantly, to the work of ensuring equity and justice for all people, I want to end this webinar with one last question that I'm going to ask each of you to respond to. It is big work, but it's important work, and it's work where we need all hands on deck. So what motivates you? You've been involved in this for a while. What motivates you to continue your efforts to advance the well-being of Black children and families? And we will begin with Dr. Austin and end with Sanithia White. So we're going to take it in alphabetical order. Go then.
Okay. Well, one, I'll just say thank you so much for putting this panel together. I'm over here taking notes of everything, so much of what my colleagues have shared, and really honestly looking forward to connecting with each of you after the webinar. And I appreciate this question a lot. So I would say Gosh, I think two things in particular that motivate me, as I mentioned at the start of the panel, having an 8-year-old son who is, literally in the sort of age range that we focus on as an organization. When I look at him and his friends and imagine the world that I believe is possible for them, I don't just see them, I see every Black child, and that keeps me going. Similar to something I said earlier, I'm also I've come to a point in my life as I've gotten older where I can say I am okay knowing that I may not be around. I probably won't be around when the great day that I'm working towards actually comes to fruition, and I believe it will, and I'm okay with that. And the last thing I'll say is that I just really lean on, again, personally and professionally, in the notion that this too shall pass. There's sort of a beauty and understanding that none of this is permanent. It's kind of beautiful and scary, but I really lean into that. Like, this too shall pass. This is not permanent. We're not meant to be here forever. But I do the work that I do every single day, and I live the way I live every single day, because I really do feel called to be here to make some sort of change. Again, a change I may not ever really see for Black children and families.
Thank you. Siobhan.
Yes, thank you very much for bringing this important panel discussion to fruition. And thank you to each of the panelists. I have learned so much from you. And thank you for this great question. So what motivates me to do the work to ensure the well-being of Black children and families? One, I look at my own personal experience, and knowing that with one wrong turn, I may not have been here on this panel today. And having the support of my grandmothers, we talk about that family circle, and not coming from a very traditional patriarchal Anglo-Saxon family, and having aunties and uncles and community members and church members who surrounded me with love and support and guidance. Those are the opportunities that I want to pass on to the teen girls and their families that I currently serve. The second thing that motivates me is that I am so empowered by what I see from our youth, and mentoring them into leadership and being able to pass the baton to them. And hopefully it's a better baton than the one I inherited. So I'm hoping to put my mark on it, but then passing it along to them with all the energy and intellect and curiosity and tenacity that they have, and watching these young women turn into the great leaders that I know that they'll be. So those are my motivators as well. And then I'll just say, personally, being a mother and having 2 teenage children, and watching them grow and explore and learn, and just wanting opportunities for them that I may not have had, and certainly my ancestors didn't have as well. So that keeps me motivated to do the work that I do.
Thank you so much.
First of all, this has been incredible. My colleagues, who I too am excited to get to know a little bit better after this webinar. But I mean, mine is fairly straightforward. Like, I love Black people, and I don't think we say that out loud enough. And I love those who aren't Black that want to see us thrive and sort of recognize the conditions that we find ourselves in this nation. And, to sort of build on some comments from earlier, there is literally no reason why we should be here, given everything we have gone through over centuries. But here we are. And I think if we can continue to build coalition and partnership, there is nothing that we can't reverse in terms of what we've experienced to bring together more wellness for our communities.
Thank you. Last but not least, Sunithia.
So the natural motivation, my 2 children, Sinai and Jace, but beyond that, it's the young Black people that I get the opportunity to interface with in this work, and then in my volunteer commitments, and making sure that what I'm doing is opening a meaningful door that they're actually interested in. And like Terrence, I love our people. We are great. We are funny. we can put a spin on something. We are conditioned to be great. The worst part about this work is having to remind yourself of that greatness, because it is not often held in the same esteem by those who are not Black folks.
Well, thank you. I cannot say how inspirational this has been. I thank you for your work and your commitment. It is clearly grounded in love. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us over the last 90 minutes and for your positive comments. I look forward to our continued collaboration. To all of you, be safe and happy Juneteenth. Goodbye.